Inflation is as much a part of the turnaround story as growth. While making this episode, we were surprised to discover just how much of a part it always has been. When the growth rates brought to us by General Musharraf and Shaukat Aziz began, Pakistan had very low inflation and a very low current account deficit. 5 years later, on the eve of a new government, inflation has skyrocketed to become the primary issue in most households across Pakistan, and the current account deficit is described as unsustainable in its present form. Today we look at inflation, and like millions of other Pakistanis, we ask, where did all the money go? Hello and welcome to The Turnaround. I'm Khurram Hussain. Any textbook will tell you that inflation occurs in an economy when you have too much money chasing too few goods. What this means is if the government resorts to increasing the money supply, the prices of things will begin to rise across the economy. Now, inflation in Pakistan has been persistently high for the past 3 years. Take a look at this graph, for instance, which shows you how quickly inflation has risen since 2004. It came down a notch or two since earlier this year, but it's still at very high levels if you compare it to what we had in the early years of General Musharraf's regime. So we start by asking a very simple question. Why did inflation in Pakistan rise so fast after 2004?
As you know, to kickstart the economy, back in 2002 and 2003, the government and the central bank employed an ultra-loose monetary policy. So basically interest rates were brought down to record lows, historic lows in Pakistan, and there was a lot of money supply growth. And in economics, as you know very well, there's a very basic sort of axiom that when there's too much money chasing too few goods, invariably it will show up in the price level going up.
That in 2002, when the country's growth rates began to accelerate, we had low inflation and a low current account deficit. Now, we fast forward to our time, we have high inflation and an unsustainable current account deficit by some reckonings. What would you make of this turnaround in our fundamentals?
It was a policy choice, and I'm very proud to say that a country with low inflation but a stagnant economy with high rates of unemployment, to me as a development economist, is of no use. Therefore, if you have a negative per capita income growth, if you look at 2001, 2002, we had a negative per capita income growth. After a very slow growth over the 1990s, there was no economic activity.
And that's exactly what happened, I think, from the period 2004, 2005, and 2006. We had high inflation simply because money supply was well in excess of growth in the goods market or growth in GDP. So that laid the basis for this. Unfortunately, after that, what's happened is, as you know, international oil prices started moving up very strongly because of global growth. And then you had factors like the government passing on that into domestic retail prices. And then more recently, we had crop failures or crop mismanagement in the case of sugar, wheat, and then global palm oil prices going up now. So it's a confluence of a number of factors, but the basis for me is basically ultra-loose monetary policy.
Now you have two choices. If you want to accelerate the economy, you use your fiscal policy lever or you use the monetary policy lever. If you use a fiscal policy lever, you have already a problem that your debt ratios were hitting the roof. So you have no room for maneuver as far as the fiscal deficits are concerned to stimulate the economy. But you have low inflation. That gives you a lot of room, and we had cleaned up our financial sector also. So we have a lot of room for maneuver as far as the monetary policy was concerned.
I think the government reading was, as well as the state bank reading, that earlier they had applied brakes, unemployment had gone up, poverty had increased, and now they wanted to kickstart the economy. And in kick-starting the economy, they did fiscal expansion and everything, but in case of monetary expansion, they did it more than that was required.
And I have got on record, and I am very happy to say that we put the accelerator on the monetary expansion. And that's the reason why a lot of new purchasing power was created in this country. From 1 million borrowers, which were catering only to the corporate sector or to the businesses or to the government, today we have 5.5 million borrowers, 2.5 million middle class, 1 million microfinance, 1 million plus in agriculture, and 500,000 in small and medium enterprises who increased their purchasing power. That money was used to increase the capacity of our manufacturing industry, which then in turn led to higher growth rates.
It's very important to be very vigilant when you have that kind of credit expansion, because it's very easy to go over the point whereby you're just supplying enough credit given the supply of goods that you avoid increase in prices. It's very difficult to estimate that. And it's very easy to overshoot it. And we overshot it. So you began to see the buildup of inflationary pressure.
That is what the monetary policy was able to do because inflation rates were under control. But in 2005, the chickens came home to roost. That means that the inflation rate went up from 4% to almost 9%.
Now, as soon as the private sector started borrowing, there was a large unutilized capacity in the industrial sector. Some of the sectors were 60% utilization, 70%, all that. Within 2 years, these utilization of the capacity touched 90, 95, and 100%. Now, this gave us, in addition to better agriculture performance, a very impressive growth rate of more than 8%.
Now, there is no policy which ought to remain constant. You have fulfilled your objective, which was to stimulate the economy through the monetary policy. Now you have to put the monetary policy gear in reverse, and you tighten the monetary policy so that the inflationary expectations and inflationary pressures are reduced.
So they had become a little bit indifferent to inflation, and they were emphasizing the performance of the economy in terms of growth rate, which I think was unwise on the part of the state bank. Government would not, they would not object to that, and they never objected to it, to inflation. Nobody's on the record to have said that, look here, inflation is.
So it seems that inflation was a calculated risk taken by the governor of the state bank during the early years of the turnaround. An expansion in the money supply was engineered to kickstart the economy about 5 years ago. And in 2004, to quote the state bank governor, the chickens came home to roost. But was this really a wise policy to promote growth with inflation? Let's find out next, right after this. Welcome back. We're looking at Pakistan's high inflation rates and found that it all began when the state bank used an ultra-loose monetary policy to kickstart the economy about 5 years ago. But was this a wise policy choice to opt for an inflationary growth process?
It was a decision which was very much a calculated decision, that at least between 2002 to 2004 or 2005, till the inflation reaches a certain stage, we should have a lax monetary policy.
This was a calculated decision.
It was a calculated
made
decision
by yourself.
Made by myself, and I take full responsibility for it.
Yes, but I think the key point is that you need to kickstart the economy in a more sustainable manner. The problem with ultra-loose monetary policy and a charge which is laid at the door of Alan Greenspan as well, as you know, is that his management, his monetary management, has also laid the basis for a creation of bubbles in the economy. And the fear is that that's exactly what we may be experiencing in Pakistan, because if you see, we've got growth, but we've got high inflation and a huge stress on the external side of the economy, which is related to the ultra-loose monetary policy.
So you're saying that the monetary policy was being used as a stimulus to get
Of course.
growth going within the economy.
This is no news.
And
This
it was understood that this is going to come, or might very well come, at the price of
inflation later on. Yes.
Later on.
Yes.
So were we not, in effect, creating a liquidity bubble in Pakistan, a consumption-driven boom?
Look, as I said, if you have 4 or 3% inflation, and you have high unemployment, and you have very stagnant economy, no development economist, they made a wrong choice by bringing in a development economist as a governor, who is not interested in inflation per se. He's interested in the well-being of the majority of the population.
At the same time, you've got the asset markets which are inflating extremely fast, be it the equity markets or real estate or the commodity markets as well. Auto financing, or sort of investment in cars in an earlier phase. All these things are manifestations of a loose monetary policy, an extra loose monetary policy.
It is only the salaried class, people like you and me, who are the worst affectees of inflation, because our salaries and wages do not rise according to the inflation. And most of the noise is pensioners, salaried class, the people who are just getting some fixed income. And as I said, I'm in a great deal of sympathy.
I wouldn't go along with that, simply because these two large groups who are losers are the purchasers of commodities, are the big sort of consumer class in Pakistan. And if their net income or real income is going down, then clearly at some stage, and we're seeing this in Pakistan, we're seeing, as I alluded to earlier, we're seeing a slowing down in economic momentum. We're seeing a slowing down in discretionary spending in the economy. So it's already, auto sales are peaking off, durable sales are peaking off.
90% of Pakistanis are either farmers or small businesses, or they are traders, or they are in transport business. And these individuals adjust their prices according to the inflation. That's what inflation is all about. So their incomes, in relative terms, remain untouched because they are adjusting. If a panwala was selling a pan for 1 rupee, after the inflation, he sells it for 1.5 rupees. Therefore, his incomes and his profits remain untouched.
I would think that even shopkeepers would probably not be benefiting from selling tomatoes at 120 rupees a kilo, or or whatever. Inflation hurts across the board.
But if 90% of Pakistanis, 60% living in the rural areas, have got from 300 rupees of wheat to 450 and now 500 rupees, they have already got adjustment for inflation. That was the background under which we worked out this equation between growth stimulus and inflation.
Now, this claim of the state bank governor is interesting. So we sent Ovais Mangalwala from the turnaround team to go to a major food market of the city and ask people how inflation has affected their lives.
Yes, Khurram, I'm standing here in Sadar Market, which is the biggest market in Karachi. People from all stratas of life come over here. Let's ask these people, how has inflation affected these people? How has the price hike affected these people? Let's validate the claim which has been made by the former governor of State Bank.
It's really becoming difficult to survive. These is even like people who are well-to-do, they can't even afford to buy these things, and it's beyond their reach.
मैं तो कहती हूँ गवर्नर साहब आए इसी वक्त आए देखें क्या हो रहा है कोई खरीदारी करे कोई उनकी बैग मात उतरे तो पता तो चले ना वो खरीदेंगी तब पता चलेगा ना कितनी महंगाई है
महंगाई बहुत बढ़ गई है थोड़ी नहीं बढ़ी बहुत बढ़ गई कमर तोड़ दी महंगाई ने
So when we go out right these days, we can catch any random person on the street, aim a camera at them and ask them, what is the number one problem you are facing in your life? They all say inflation.
Yes, it is.
Do they not understand these equations that you are telling me? Do they not understand the complexity of the matter?
पेट का करे, बच्चों का करे, किसका करे?
उनके बोलने से क्या होता है? यहाँ लो आवाम से पूछो क्या हाल है उनका। हम तो दुकानदार हैं, हमारे पास कम से कम रोज़ाना हज़ारों ग्राहक आते हैं। हर ग्राहक यही कहता है महंगाई बहुत बढ़ी है, बहुत ज़्यादा है।
Are you denying the fact that a trader, a pan wala, a fruit wala, they do not adjust the prices according to inflation? What is inflation?
जो लोग आपके पास आते हैं चीज़ें खरीदने के लिए, वो महंगी चीज़ें खरीदते हैं तो ज़्यादा पैसे देते हैं आपको।
महंगा चीज़ एक महंगी आ रही है तो महंगी, क्योंकि उसमें मुनाफा और कम होता है, बढ़ता नहीं है, कम होता है। जितनी चीज़ सस्ती होगी उसका मुनाफा ज़्यादा होता है, जितनी चीज़ महंगी होगी उसका मुनाफा और कम हो जाता है।
तो फिर फ़ायदा किसको है इससे?
फ़ायदा उसी का है जिनके पास माल होता है, ज़ख़ीरा अंदोज़ जो करते हैं उन्हीं का फ़ायदा है, जिनके पास माल ज़्यादा होता है।
पहले 8 की 10 की आइटम 10 की बिकती थी, अब 19 साढ़े 19 की आइटम 20 की बिक रही है, तो प्रॉफिट तो कम है ना। इन्वेस्टमेंट डबल हो गई, प्रॉफिट उसकी आधी हो गई।
महंगा है तो कोई लेते ही नहीं है इतना। तनख्वाह क्या है, कैसे लेंगे भाई? जेब में इजाज़त देगी तो लेंगे ना। तो हमारा तो उल्टा दुकान नहीं चल रहा है बाहर।
Inflation is the increase in the price level. And who is doing this? It is the people who are either on the production stream or who are in the trading or the distribution stream.
Khurram, I have talked to a lot of shopkeepers over here and they claim that the purchasing power and the standard of living of the common people of Pakistan has decreased, and in turn the profit margins of these shopkeepers have also decreased. And in light of these claims, you can evaluate what the government is claiming. Over to you, Khurram.
Okay, thank you, Ovais. A general consensus appears to be that the policy of inflation with growth was not misguided in principle, but was perhaps pushed too far or pursued with too much zeal, therefore allowing inflation to get out of control. But these are fine judgments to draw, as many people have already pointed out. How many people, at the time when this policy was at its zenith, saw the consequences and sounded the alarms back then? More on that next, right after this break. Welcome back. We're about to find out whether the State Bank governor received warnings about the excessively loose monetary policy he was following during the early years of the turnaround. And if he did, how did he deal with them? When did the World Bank first begin to sound the alarms that levels of liquidity expansion, or particularly levels of the monetary aggregates, are getting too large for comfort in Pakistan?
You know, it's if you read World Bank documents consistently, those kinds of warning signals, or not so much warning signals, but alerting the reader to possible risks associated with the strategy, those are always. I mean, the World Bank, in that sense, is a very careful organization. With each strategy, they're required to look at the risks associated with that strategy, and then to say a little bit about how you mitigate those risks. And that approach the bank has taken throughout in all of its policy dialogue with the government. That this strategy is going to give you growth. However, there is the likely risk of.
So, do you recall when the first alarms began to sound within the World Bank that monetary expansion has gone too far in Pakistan?
Again, you know, it'd be difficult to pin down to a specific date when the alarm began to sound, but you can say that the frequency of the dialogue around the inflation numbers started when the inflation numbers began to look bad, which was about 3 to 4 years ago.
In 2004. 2003 Article 4 consultation that the IMF carried out with Pakistan clearly notes the increase in private sector credit growth and a growth in broad money indicators around the economy, in Pakistan's economy. Yet it stops short of advising a tightening of monetary policy in that time period. So was 2003 not the right time to start taking note of a build-up of inflationary pressures in Pakistan's economy?
Well, if you read my paper, I mean, this is the point we make, that if you've got a lag of about a year and a half before you start seeing inflation show up in after increase in credit and money. And I would argue that in those circumstances, you should have seen this coming. But the fact is, I mean, it's in 2005 that I look back. I mean, it's easier for me in hindsight to look back and say, gee, really, you should have thought about this
But sir, the central bank or the state bank at that point in time, whose job it is to monitor liquidity levels in the economy, whose job it is to basically be on the lookout for inflation and maintain price stability, did they not have the means available at their disposal in 2003 to be able to tell that liquidity levels have now risen to a point where the economy is pregnant with
Well,
inflationary
I think
pressure?
you have to sort of put yourself in a situation where you haven't sort of seen any real evidence as yet that in 6, 12, 18 months time this liquidity is going to show up in inflation. People hadn't done that work, and this is why I read the paper. I mean, people hadn't done that work. But what I think is it's difficult if you put yourself in the shoes of the central bank, that you've got high levels of liquidity relative to what you should have, but you don't see any signs of inflation at all. At that time, remember, there's nothing happening on the inflation front. It's a bit tough in those circumstances from just a political economic point of view.
In fact, when did the IMF first note the build-up of inflationary pressures in the economy? When did it first say, take note of the fact that, when did it first begin to sound the alarm bells that inflation appears to be on the horizon?
2004.
2004, 1 year before.
Yes.
At what point in time did you become aware, or at what point in time did you make this choice that we are aware of the fact that our decision will have inflationary consequences, but we are going to pay that price and go ahead and?
2005.
In 2005 when you became aware?
Yes.
So
because I was monitoring every quarter as to what the inflationary pressures were coming in. And we have a very transparent monetary policy statement which is published every 6 months.
So when did you first become aware, or when did you first begin to receive reports from within the state bank that the economy is developing?
End of 2004 and the beginning of 2005, and in the first monetary policy statement of 2005, we took action to tighten the monetary policy.
At what point did the state bank become aware, or people within the state bank become aware, that inflation, the threat of inflation is now looming large, and at what point did they begin to sound the alarms that something needs to be done?
I would say that would be about 2003 or maybe 2004.
And at what point did the state bank start to tighten monetary policy in
That
response?
was in April 2005.
But sir, isn't it a fact that as early as 2003, some of the monetary aggregates and the amount of liquidity in the system was already beginning to ring some alarm bells?
Look, in hindsight, everybody is very wise. But when you are confronted with a situation in 2003, when you had only 3% GDP growth rate, you will not put a brake on the monetary policy, because that is the stimulus which is really going to get the growth going.
You raised this with the governor state bank. What was his response?
Well, he just listened to it and he said, well, look at the growth. Growth is doing very well, and I cannot deny credit if there's a demand for credit from the private sector. I would say he had his own perception.
So were there other parties within the state bank that were also cautioning or sounding the alarm?
At least in the research department, people were cautioning him.
So it turns out that the policy of negative real interest rates designed to kickstart the economy did spark some concerns within the state bank, the IMF and the World Bank. But few, if any, of the people involved actually went public with their concerns. Inflation in Pakistan shot up during 2004, largely as a result of this excessively loose monetary policy. To this day, it has not been brought under control.
It's the poor always are is the group that suffers the most in high inflation.
Central bankers need to draw the line somewhere, and clearly, in my opinion, we probably crossed that line in our desperation to kickstart the economy.
You must also remember that, like the consumer, there is a second side, which is production. If you had 26 million liters of milk, today, because of the higher prices of milk, the milk production has gone up to 33 million tons.
It's the impact on the poor that should be the deciding factor in how to think about inflation.
Inflation is a very difficult thing to handle. It has to be, it is a fire. One should not play with it.
What's going to convince the government that 6.5 is too high is not me, but my economic models, and it's not the newspapers. It's going to be the people in doing the voting. I mean, it's going to be the voters.
हमारे क़ुव्वत बर्दाश्त से ये सब चीज़ें बाहर हो चुकी हैं। अल्लाह को याद करते हैं और कोशिश करते हैं गुजारा कर लें थोड़ी बहुत चीज़ों में। अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
Next week on the turnaround, privatization, divestment or fire sale. Join us. Until then, stay safe.